All right, everyone, welcome to episode 7 of the Backyard Banter Podcast. My name is Matt Harmon. If you've been listening along with the series, you know that what we're talking about on this show is essentially how did you, answering the question that we always get in the industry, how did you get your job? How did you get from where, being just a regular everyday person to being a regular everyday person that talks about football for a living? So we've actually got a really great guest on today, somebody that I have been a reader of, a follower of for a long time. It's Matt Williamson. He used to be a scout for the Cleveland Browns. Did a lot of work with it was Pittsburgh and Akron. I'm sure we'll get into that. And also, most recently was with ESPN, hosting the Football Today podcast. And now he's working with Ryan McDowell from DLF doing the Dynasty Blueprint podcast. I was just a guest on that recently. Definitely worth checking out. But Matt, how are you doing tonight? I think this is the second Matt on Matt show I've done so far.
Nice. It's great to talk to you, man. Yeah, I mean, it's a really cool podcast that you've done. I've probably listened to about half of them. I think it's a heck of a good idea. It was great having you on our podcast. I'm excited to kind of tell my story, and it's a long one. I mean, I'm 42 years old. I've been doing this now 15 years, give or take, that I haven't had a real job. Like you mentioned, Ryan, he's a teacher during the day, and I've never had to go that route where I didn't have to do something besides football once I made this my career.
Yeah, man, and I have to say, like, your podcast, I think I've mentioned this to you privately, like, back when I was in college and I wasn't like writing or anything, the Football Today podcast was like the first football podcast I listened to. Like, any media that I consumed, it was like, holy shit, like, there's actually guys that talk about this intelligently, and it's not like it's not just like hot takes on TV. And like, it was a big, like, mind blowing moment. And then you ended up, I think, like, so I started following you on Twitter, and like I remember when you would host the chats on ESPN, I would get in on those, and it was through you that I actually ended up finding On the Couch, because you were a guest one time, and then that's how I ended up finding like Sigmund Bloom and Matt Waldman, and it was like, oh my God, these are the guys I want to think like this. Like,
yeah,
I want to be, I want to be these guys, and like then I ended up obviously working for Football Guys, and now with NFL. So this is the cool part about doing this show, is that like for me, it's still like I still think it's like the coolest thing in the world that like I get to like just talk with these guys that I've obviously been a big fan of forever and like have influenced my journey. And it's a cool thing, I think, for the listeners too, to see like, hey, this can happen to anybody, and like, there's a lot to learn from each other. So that's enough about me. I think we'll get started talking about your story. So first thing I just want to ask, and I know that, like you said,
I don't want to interrupt you real quick, but I do want to say, that's an honor for you to say all those things. And the Football Day podcast was awesome. I was on it for 10 years, and when I announced that I was leaving ESPN, that was right at the beginning of the year, right in January 1st. And you sent me a really nice note saying a lot of those things of how I helped, kind of your path. And so that's a real honor. Thank you for mentioning that. That was very cool of you.
Yeah, man. I mean, that's what this podcast is all about, is like, paying it forward to other people, and, like remembering where you came from, because I think there's, and you probably agree with this, and, working full time in the industry for a long time, there's a lot of people that come across as just like very paranoid about their own status, and like, I don't want to help other people because they might take my spot. But it's like, I don't know, man, there's a lot of room for everybody here. We were talking before the show about how much we're on each other's podcasts and stuff. So no, it's cool. And like, it's important, I think, to remember that sort of stuff, and to be kind to each other. We've talked about that a lot on this show too. So yeah, for sure, it's my pleasure, and let's get right into it. So I know like you said, you've been doing this for a long time, and but how did it all like get started? Like, how did Matt Williamson come to like fall in love with football?
Well, being born in 1973 and living your whole life in Pittsburgh, you can kind of do the math of the Steelers were pretty big here when I was a kid. 70 Steelers, changed this entire city massively, obviously. So my first memories of football were, honestly, the first game I remember was a huge party with my family, was the Steelers' 4th Super Bowl win over the Rams. I was 6 or 7 years old, and just thinking, man, this is so awesome, and everybody loves this game. And, I very much attribute Chuck Noll, Terry Bradshaw, the Rooneys, Joe Green, that if it wasn't for those guys, I would not be doing this for a living. I very much believe that. And growing up, I never played the game. I mean, I was always the kid on my minor league baseball team that didn't hit real well and was a slow first baseman and was okay, but never went to an all-star game. I mean, I stopped playing basketball and baseball and stuff by the time I was in like 7th grade. I just wasn't very athletic. And, my dad kind of told me at a young age, yeah, it's like, Matt, you're never going to be fast, buddy, And so I always had a mind for the game, though. And I would just study as much as you ever could back then, like when draft guides would come out, Kuiper's guides. I could tell you left, back and front when I was 13 years old. And, back then the draft was not on a weekend. So my mom, she's a great woman, obviously, but she was pretty hardcore. Like if I had 103 fever, I was going to school. But on draft day, I stayed home every year. I mean, it was the biggest day by far of the year for me from age 9 probably until now. I mean, like my girlfriend, or my wife, when she was my girlfriend, I had to explain to her, like, this weekend's draft weekend, hon. I mean, don't come around. I mean, I'm busy, and even I remember like early 80s, I used to write Chuck Noll a letter once a month, once every 2 months, a handful of times a year at least. And he would write some form letter back. I mean, I remember telling him how this elaborate plan, how the Steelers should trade for Marcus Allen, and I was 10 years old or something like that. Wow. So, I mean, it was the biggest deal in the world to me. I collected football cards. I watched every Steeler game. I watched, football all the time and loved every second of it.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like, I mean, I actually dated a girl in high school for over a year, and her family's from Pittsburgh. They all still live there. We lived in Northern Virginia, and I remember just the intensity of it. And like, I grew up watching football, obviously, but was never like, my family wasn't like born and bred into it. And yeah. I just remember the culture of it was almost like, was like shocking. And I remember this was the year we were together was, I think, the 2008 season where the Panthers, and because I grew up a Panthers fan, my family's from Carolina, like, they were really hot. That was like the double trouble year. And the Steelers were really good too. And I remember there was like this almost like pre-contention to like Matt, if these two teams meet in the Super Bowl, like you have to, like, our daughter has to break up with you. And like, that's sort of, it's like, I was like, really? That's
what it's going to be. Yeah.
No. Yeah. But so,
yeah, but it was ingrained that you hate the Browns. Back then you didn't worry about the Bengals. You absolutely hated the Raiders. The Raiders were the number one rivalry. You hate the Raiders. You hate Dallas too. Like that was ingrained as a young kid. And even to this day, during the season on a Monday, Pittsburgh's a lot different if the Steelers win or lose. I mean, it just really is. Right. I mean, the whole tone of the city.
It is very funny thinking about that. Like, some towns are just like that. Like it is Steelers country. And like now I live in Los Angeles, and obviously the Rams are just like back out here. And like, I just could never imagine like, and I obviously was not around. I don't even know if I was, maybe I was alive when the Rams were in Los Angeles before, but so obviously I have no memory of that, but I can't imagine this town getting that way. So it's interesting to hear like that some towns are just so much more like that. So going from, obviously growing up, having it ingrained in you being, football for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, like when did you kind of realize like this is what I want to do? And then how did you start to make that dream a reality?
Well, I always remember, like, for example, it used to be, I assume it's still this way, like whenever you apply to a college, so that was 91. I graduated high school in 91. You apply to a college, and one of the questions is like an essay. If you could have dinner with anyone, who would it be? I picked Tom Donahoe, who was the GM of the Steelers. Like nobody wants to hang out with the scouts and the GMs. I mean, they want to hang out with Bradshaw or Green or Knoll. like I wanted to get behind the decision makers of building a roster. I mean, I wanted to have dinner with Tom Donahoe, and I've actually gotten to know him. He's from Pittsburgh. He's from the same town. the same area, Mount Lebanon, that I went to, and he's given me advice over my career. He's a great person. But back then I didn't know him. So I went to college for, well, a long time as a classic underachiever. I graduated with a 2.1 GPA in creative writing after 12 terms.
Oh, man.
Yeah. I mean, like I could barely do any less work to get out of there. Spent a lot of
That's
time
okay.
in the dirty house. Yeah, a lot of time.
If it makes you feel better, Eric Stoner, who was our last guest on episode 6, he said that after 1 year, San Diego State kindly asked him to leave. So
I was always right above that line. You know, like I graduated with a 2.1. If you go below a 2.0, they told you to leave. And so, I mean, I did the bare minimum. I always consider myself reasonably intelligent, but I didn't work hard at all. And did the same thing in high school, really. So when I came out of Pitt Johnstown, I wasn't really qualified. It wasn't like corporate world was beating down my door. Like, here's $100,000 job on Wall Street or anything. But what I had worked every summer was my neighbor was an older guy, and he had a pool cleaning business, a swimming pool servicing business. And he was like 65, 70 years old. And every year, which was 6 years of me being in college, I would come home, make decent money. And by the end, you know, by like the 4th or 5th summer, I would have my own crew, and he would say, go take care of these 10 pools today or whatever, and give me the truck, and I would go do it. So when I graduated high school, or when I graduated college, I bought the business from him. And it did very well. It's a successful business all through the South Hills of Pittsburgh, taking care of expensive pools. But I had winters off. You know, I mean, there's not a lot of pool business in December in Pittsburgh, obviously. So, you know, after a couple winters of just basically goofing off, I decided, you know, what do I want to do? I have these couple months every year. I wonder if somehow I could volunteer time and do something scouting related. And it took me a long time to even know those angles. I mean, like most people that end up in the league or as scouts or whatever, they call their old coach, you know, everybody knows somebody. I didn't know a soul. You know, I just was like, I like watching the Steelers on TV. I want to be a scout. And so what was really cool is one of the pools that we took care of is Mary Lemieux's old house, the house that Lemieux built in Mount Lebanon when he came to Pittsburgh, and Ralph Sinrich bought it off of Mario. And the Stanley Cup was in that pool. I mean, and if you don't know who Ralph Sinrich is, he's one of the biggest agents at the time. He had Will Shields and Dermonti Dawson, and he played at Pitt. And, you know, at the time, I didn't even realize how influential and powerful he was. He was one of the biggest agents in the NFL at the time, and was very good at it. And I remember him just kind of hanging around the pool one day, and I'm talking to him saying, you know, if you have any advice, how could I just go do something in the winters to kind of get my feet wet and learn? And, you know, don't have to hog the airways, but the next step was, the first thing I started to do was a guy around here named Joe Butler. He and Tom Donahoe opened a scouting service called Metro Scouting, and they were rivals before there was rivals. You know, like all the high school kids, Metro would grade you, and then they would sell their stuff to Pitt, Penn State, West Virginia, whatever. He had a huge camp for high school kids, and Joe knew everybody. So I started just going down to his place and sitting there watching high school tape with him 3 or 4 days a week, you know. And Ralph knew Joe and said, hey, Matt seems like he's interested. He's a smart young guy. So I just started hanging with Joe at his place, you know, watching high school tape and learning what to kind of learn from. And Joe knew a lot of people. And then, you know, I took a next step, which we can get to here, but it's, you know, that was my first actual, and I had to make a cent for it. He'd buy me like a piece of pizza for lunch, you know, and I would make copies and, you know, call coaches and, you know, just help out. But I just wanted to learn how to judge talent.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people kind of don't realize, is that you almost don't get into being a scout by being a scout. You get into being a scout seemingly by just being there. And we talked about Eric actually talked about this again on the last episode. He was like, if you want to be a scout or like work for the NFL, like get off Twitter. Like that's not your avenue. Like go get get involved or whatever. So it seems like you're kind of along that same path. So from there, obviously you're hanging around with these guys, kind of starting to get your feet wet. When did you first get like an official offer or something like what's the next step?
Well, the next step was Seton LaSalle High School around here, which is a very good school. Jim Sweeney played there. I mean, the high school football is big around here, and this is one of the better ones around. Said, hey, we could really use another hand during our camps. You know, they were opening basically training camp, and Bruce Gradkowski was their starting quarterback at the time. I mean, that shows how old it was. Bruce was his senior year of high school. And, you know, he went on, did great things and still in the league, obviously. And I was there for like 2 months just helping them through training camp. And it was the first time I'd ever been affiliated with a football team. Like I said, I didn't play, you know, but I got the feel of things. And Greg Gattuso was the head coach at Duquesne. He played at Seton LaSalle and was at some practices. And he's like, Matt, hey, why don't you come help us this whole season at Duquesne, which is a small, university around here. If you don't know, Lee Bodden was on the team at the time. And I volunteered for an entire football season. And, basically I did everything, at that level. Like the linebacker coach and the offensive line coach, they make like $1,000. So there's a lot of practices the linebacker coach doesn't show up. So, hey, Matt, why don't you coach the linebackers today? Why don't you film practice today? I handled all the recruiting tape, So I spent a season with the Duquesne Dukes, not making a cent, totally volunteer, and ate it up like crazy.
So at this time, you're just was this during right? Okay, so you're basically living off what you're making in the pool business.
Which is good. My wife had my wife deserves all the credit in the world. I mean, she allowed me to do all these things, and she had a really good, stable job. We had a house together, no kids. I was in my mid-20s. So, this was all gravy.
So, yeah, actually, I kind of want to hit on that because it's something that I haven't really discussed with anybody yet so far. But, like, what is that dynamic like? Because I know that I mean, I've never been in a serious relationship. Well, okay, I was in one serious relationship when I started writing, and it quickly did not work out because that's what I do. But anyways, so I've never been in like a relationship dynamic. Obviously, I'm not married. I'm 24 years old, so I'm not looking to be. But like, when you're chasing that dream, when you're putting in all these extra hours, is that kind of like a stressful thing on the relationship? If you feel comfortable talking about that at all.
I certainly will, and the next step is where it gets hairy. Right. At Duquesne, it wasn't that big a deal. Like, yeah, I might go on a road trip when we played Iona, but it was a bus trip, and you came home that night. We didn't have kids anyways. I would go spend a day, 4 days a week, maybe down there during the off season of the pool business when it was cold out. But then Duquesne hired a guy named Mauro Mons, who's still coaching, as their offensive coordinator. And I'm sitting there talking to Mauro, and I'm like, well, where'd you come from? He's like, well, I was the recruiting assistant at Pitt. And he's like, you know what? They're looking for my replacement. So he called the right people over there and got me an interview. And I think I basically interviewed, there was probably 20 or 30 people interviewing for the job. Most of them, I can guarantee 99% of them are all former players. I'm sure most of the guys played at Pitt. I know a couple of them. And Walt Harris was the head coach, and I got the gig. I was and so they called up and they said, Matt, we're going to pick you. You're going to be our recruiting GA. I was a assistant recruiting coordinator. I was a graduate assistant. So then you go have the conversation with the wife of, this pool business that's making 40, 50 grand a year and allows me to do nothing all winter. Well, I'm going to take 12 grand a year and go be a graduate assistant at Pitt and work 90-hour weeks and make like a quarter an hour. And so awesome. Yeah. So that was the breaking point. That was really the turning point, because that's whenever I gave everything else up. And from that day on, I've only worked in football. Every paycheck I've ever gotten since that day has been football driven. So she was like, do it. I got a good job here. We don't have kids. It's quite the opportunity. I can't believe you even got the job. Not that she was saying I couldn't, but it seemed like a long shot for them to hire me, and they did. And and I was there for 3 years, and I can tell you some stuff we did there and learned, but that was the turning point.
Yeah, for one, that's pretty sick to, kind of get that job. That's like, you beat the odds. That's always
right.
Pretty empowering. And again, a lot of it's through the relationship that you built. And had you not known that person that hooks you up with the interview, it's what the important thing about like making connections, and everything like that. But no, that is something
I think one thing that helped me too is, most of the kids that I was going against for that GA job were guys that just finished playing. They were younger than me. At this point, I owned a house. I was probably 5 years older than the other GAs I was, shooting for the job against. I'd owned my own business for 4 years and made money. So I'm sure that I interviewed reasonably well. Like, this guy's not a slapdick.
Yeah, for sure. But that also does kind of underscore, again, the point that I did want to have you make there about the like potential, like you said, breaking point of like, I gotta ask my wife to take on, or kind of a big
leap of faith. Money, right?
Yeah, right. You're not gonna make any money. It's gonna be
I'm never gonna be there.
Yeah, it's going to be a ton of time away, but because I think some people will face that, and like it really does kind of have a test of like how much does your significant other really support your dreams, because they have to play a part in that too. And there's probably some stories that I think go the other way.
Most, I would say, and to her credit, she's like, if you want to do it, that's great. I'm all behind you. But she didn't even know what a first down was at that point. She didn't grow up watching football at all. She kind of grew up farmish, not an inner city person by any stretch. And, she wasn't a football fan. She didn't know what it was all about or how popular it was or what it's like to go to a Pitt game or whatever. But my 3 years at Pitt were awesome. I mean, we went to 3 bowl games. It was my first year was Antonio Bryant's last year at Pitt. And then the next 2 years were both of Larry Fitzgerald's years there. So, I watched Larry's recruiting tape, helped recruit him to Pitt. And by the end there, I mean, I watched, Joe Flacco. I helped get him to Pitt, who transferred. I mean, that was actually one of my best finds, that his tape just came. My major responsibility at Pitt was back then you would get like 30 or 40 VHS tapes a day at Pitt for high school players. I want to play at Pitt. Here's something I typed up. Watch my highlight film and these, and that's all I did all day was watch high school tape. And nobody knew who this Flacco character was. And I'm like, man, this kid can sling it. And I took it to the head coach and, it all fell into place. I think we beat Ohio University on him or somebody very small, but I watched Revis's high school tape and Shady McCoy was right after I was there. And Terrell Pryor was right after I was there. So I watched all those guys right after I left. And we were a good team. We were a top 20 team basically those 3 years. And I learned an awful lot. And Chris LaSala, their director of football operations, is still a great friend of mine and was a huge influence. And just being around such a big organization and, learning from the coaches and just spending all that time watching tape and got to be pretty good buddies with Larry. And, he would sit there and watch with us and he'd be like, dude, we can't recruit this kid. He stinks, and so it was a lot of fun. And the other perk was, I don't know if you know this, but Pitt and the Steelers share a facility. So really? And there's a cafeteria. So I kind of got to know Kevin Colbert and the people over there. And I actually interviewed twice for basically the same position with the Steelers. It's a scouting intern. And I didn't get the job either time. And those were like crushing blows. I'm like, I'm going to die as the Pitt's GA,
Well, how do you bounce back from that kind of disappointment? Because we've all been there. Like we've interviewed for jobs we haven't gotten, but especially when it's something like, man, this is the thing that I like. This is the thing I want to be my thing. Yeah, like especially like you grew up a Steelers fan, like all that sort of stuff. So like, how do you?
It would almost been too easy. I mean, if that path would have been too easy, But it was heartbreaking. I was like, boy, I should get this job. It's perfect for me. But I do know both people that beat me out for them, and they're both still in the league scouting. They're great people. They're very good at their job. So it's not like, man, I can't believe that they gave it to this jerk off. It was. But what happened was after 3 really good seasons with Pitt, our wide receivers coach, who'd coached Antonio Bryant and Larry Fitzgerald, J.D. Brookhart, became the head coach at Akron, which is only 2 hours away. And he's like, Matt, do you want to go be my director of football operations? So I took that job, and that was the first time I had to move, which is another stress, like it talked about, was my wife stayed in Pittsburgh, and I moved to Akron. So she had a house. She worked downtown Pittsburgh at PNC and made good money. And we saw each other on the weekends. And,
for people that don't know, and myself included, how far away is like Akron and Pittsburgh?
2.5-ish, 2 hours, give or take. So
right. So it's a commitment to make the trek from.
But luckily, JD didn't get to be the head coach at Tulsa or Washington State. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, at least it was drivable that I could see her every weekend and we'd go out to dinner, and I had a crappy ass apartment that I was never in. It was like $200 a month, and I just had a mattress on the floor and a VHS recorder. It was just garbage, But that was an unbelievable experience. And I was only at Akron for like 8 months, and that was when Charlie Fry was there, Hickson and Chase Blackburn, a couple guys that went to the league, and they were really good players at the college level. But I wasn't there during the season. So what's really weird and crazy is you get to Akron, this whole group, and at this point we had 0 recruits. We had we didn't even know where the anything on campus was. I'm giving tours to campus and just learning as I go. we're trying to build a recruiting class, and they're trying to install offense and learn who the players are. And it's just an unbelievable hectic time. And there's not enough hours in the day. And meanwhile, I'm doing things like setting all the travel arrangements for next year, like booking hotels at Penn State for the opening game and figuring out the bus schedule to get us there and flights and all these kinds of things, and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and not really knowing what I'm doing.
Yeah, because that seems like it's kind of a different job from the recruiting perspective.
I didn't love it, to be honest. Yeah. I didn't love it. I mean, I still watched all the high school tape with the coaches and whatnot, but I didn't like like I organized Akron's pro day,
right?
Which was huge because I got to know a lot of scouts.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's a good opportunity to meet people, but I could see, that would not be like, you're basically an event planner in a way. I mean, like that sort of thing.
You do everything that the head coach doesn't want to do. Right. That's what JD told me. He's like, you can do everything I don't want to do. I'm like, that's great.
That's thick. So, I mean,
but that actually made a little bit of money. I mean,
yeah,
I made $35,000 as the director of football ops. So it wasn't like I was making $12,000 a year anymore. So it was like, okay, I mean, I'm a guy now. I mean, I can at least buy.
That's a big thing to put on the resume.
Right, exactly. And one of the things while we were there, the Browns are Cleveland's only half an hour away from Akron. And one of the things we wanted to do was, one of our goals was, let's develop a relationship with the Browns, so we can go there and watch tape or, hit them up for advice. And that kind of goes back to the Pitt Steelers thing. It was a pretty nice resource for the Panthers to have the Steelers next door. And I used it like crazy in recruiting. Like, hey, let's see what's going on outside. Oh, the Steelers are practicing. I didn't know. There's Ben. If you're a 16-year-old kid in Pittsburgh, that goes a long way. So that was something we did. We started to reach out to the Browns just to kind of build a relationship there.
And that's your next stop, right? Is right. With Cleveland. So how do we get from Akron to Cleveland?
So the GM of the Browns, Pete Garcia at the time, and Butch Davis was the head coach. They had just taken over the Browns after wildly successful seasons at the U. And Butch was the defense coordinator for Jimmy Johnson's with the Cowboys, and all kinds of the U, and they were the U, ties there. Chudzinski was the tight ends coach, and Pagano was the defensive backs coach. And I mean, we had a lot of head coaches on that team and a lot of really strong coaches. But anyways, that's not what you asked. I had talked to their GM, and he said, you have a lot of guys coming through there. We're looking for a scout. Do you know of anyone? And I'm like, yeah, me.
All right.
I'm like, I'll drive there right this second. So he interviewed me, and it was like a day-long interview. It was very cool. You bounced around. I mean, I sat down with Butch for an hour. I sat with different, position coaches, and they stuck me in a dark room for a couple hours. And I remember I watched 2 games of Andre Davis, who was one of their linebackers, 2 games of somebody else that was in the league that was going to be a free agent, and a college kid. And I had to write reports. They just gave me like a notebook and a pencil, and I wrote reports on all 3 of them of what I thought. And a couple days later, they called me, and I got that job. And I beat a lot of people for that job. I mean, not to brag, but I mean, that was they were interviewing a lot of people, and I got it.
I happily welcome bragging on this podcast. You're allowed to brag about yourself, especially that is. I mean, I got the league,
I mean, that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's good. So when you're with the Browns, I mean, I think people kind of tend to know what an NFL scout does, but I actually kind of, like, you mentioned the reports you were writing. What's the difference between a media scouting report and an NFL scouting report? Is there a difference, or what does that look like?
Much different. They're a lot longer. Well, they're a lot more team specific too. That's true. If you listen to Daniel Jeremiah or Bucky Brooks or any of those guys that did that too, they'll all say a hard transition was, a 4-3 end is for example, when I was there, we went through in typical Browns fashion. I was there for 365 days. I was there from the day after they drafted Kellen Winslow, from the U, and from the day after we drafted Braylon Edwards, 3rd overall. So I was in the war room and all that for the Braylon Edwards draft, which happens to be the Aaron Rodgers draft. Alex Smith went first that year, Ronnie Brown. And what was crazy is during my year there, we lost a lot of football games. Butch got let go, I think, like week 10 or 11. He was replaced by an interim coach, Rabisky, and then Romeo took over. So in my 365 days, I saw 2 GMs and 3 head coaches, which is kind of how it's still going in Cleveland.
Yeah.
So, but in a way, I mean, like, and under Butch, in typical, U fashion, we ran a pretty strict 4-3. We had a 3 technique, a nose tackle, a Mike, a Will, a Sam, and then Romeo comes in from New England, and basically all that scouting that we did wasn't useless, but it was a totally different system, and we had to look at all the same players through different eyes again. So that's one of the many problems with turnover in the league, and the Browns are obviously the worst example ever. But I was kind of a different type of scout too. I had about 20 colleges, and I cross-checked a lot of the tight ends and a lot of the first-round type guys. And I was also in charge of the CFL, the Canadian Football League, and I told them to go get Cameron Wake, but everybody got fired, and we kind of forgot about that. And I also was in charge of the NFC West, which, for those that don't know, there's a GM, there's a director of pro scouting, and there's a director of college scouting. Well, I answered to both those guys, and they're very different. So I watched every snap of the Seahawks, Rams, Niners, Cardinals. And if somebody would happen to become available, I had to, run up to our director of football or pro scouting and be like, their, third guard that they just cut is better than one of our guys. Let's pick them up off waivers. Or, all these guys are about to be free agents. I had to have grades on all those guys. So I had to have a grade on everyone in the NFC West, 300, at all times.
That's a lot. That's a lot of players for sure. So how many, when you're scouting for the Browns for the year there, like how many hours a week are you working generally? Like as a scout?
Well, still, I went to Cleveland. My wife stayed in Pittsburgh, so I never had any reason to go home. So I was there a lot. 90-hour weeks all the time. Oh, wow. Because I didn't have anything else to do. And you wouldn't know this, but NFL organizations make it very easy for you to hang out there too. Like I would put my dry cleaning in my locker and it would come back. I would get your hair cut there, and this is actually kind of a funny story, is my boss on the pro side was Jeremy Green, Dennis Green's son. And he's actually how I got the ESPN. Well, he comes upstairs and I'm like, just get a haircut. He's like, yeah, man, I just got a haircut. They're every Thursday and Friday is haircut day here. You go down to the locker room where the players are and you can get a haircut. They make it very easy for you not to ever leave the building. There's ice cream on hand at all times. There's so much food, you can't even believe it. So I go down there and I'm standing in line, and finally everyone's kind of chuckling. I'm like, what the heck's going on here? It's Thursday, and I finally, it's my turn. I sit down and I realize I'm the only white dude in the room. And they all start laughing at me. They're like, dude, the white barber comes on Fridays, man. I'm like, I'm like, oh, okay. I guess that adds up. He's like, I wouldn't know what to do with your head. I'm like, oh man, okay. So everyone's just kind of chuckling at my expense as I'm standing there in line for half an hour or whatever. But all kinds of things like that you would never think of. But there's, the facility's awesome.
Yeah, that sounds pretty sick. That's funny too. It's a good story.
But we were terrible. We won 2 games and I got fired.
Well, okay. So before we get to the getting fired part, like how much? Because you hear this all the time, and I want to convey this to listeners too, especially if there's anybody listening out there and they want to get in the league. Like, it's not a glamorous job, right? As much as you'd think of like, oh, you're an NFL scout. Like, what is
traveling stinks?
Yeah.
And I was never full-time on the road like an area scout, but I can't imagine being a West Coast scout because those schools are so far apart. Yeah. I did everything basically within, I went from considering where Cleveland is, I went from Syracuse, Boston College, Maryland. I'm trying to think how far I'd went. Basically, and one of our rules was, if it's 6 hours drive or less, you drove it. If it's more than 6, you fly. So I basically had like a 6-hour radius of the schools that I went to. But those aren't that far apart. I mean, you could do West Virginia and then do Pitt, for example, the next day. But some of these ones on the West Coast are, 15 hours apart or whatever. So it's crazy. And you get to a college, spend all day there watching tape and talking to people and watching practice. And then you drive like crazy to the next school, get to a hotel, write reports, sleep, get up early, rinse, repeat. Everything's like Groundhog Day.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. That's what I had imagined it would be. And I mean, that obviously when I decided I wanted to work and, wanted to try to pursue a career in football, the one thing I was like, I don't think I could ever do that. That just doesn't,
And I was lucky enough because I was in the facility a lot. All the pro stuff is in the building. It's just tape work. I would watch the Rams game over and over. And, Walter Jones, he's really good. Orlando Pace, he's really good. And so when I was on the road, I was new to it, but it wasn't exclusively what I did.
Yeah.
But I also was involved in whenever you bring in free agents during the week and you try them out, I did stuff like that too. And, we would talk to agents and, they were always calling saying, hey, my guy got cut from the Bears. Can we bring him in for a workout? Maybe you guys could use him, which we often could because we had one of the worst rosters in the league.
Right. So obviously you mentioned everybody gets fired. It's Cleveland, organizational turnover. And that's what happens, right? I mean, when regimes change, usually guys like yourself, like just another scout, usually just end up out of a job, not because of your performance, but just because that's like what happens.
Yeah, right. I mean, and I totally got it. I mean, I didn't take it personal at all. By the time when we were in that war room, that was the year we took Braylon, I said, third overall, and Phil Savage was in charge of the room, and I learned a ton from him. I mean, he's really good talent evaluator. In terms of anyone I've ever watched deal with players, I thought he was the best, and I thought his scouting reports just were very fluid and they were very easy to listen to. They weren't choppy, and they really told a story with the scouting reports. So
that's rare, even from the media side. I see
absolutely
out there that write scouting reports. And it's like, this is terrible to read.
Garbage, choppy, yeah. And so I learned a ton from him. And the day after we selected Braylon, actually kind of a little story too, was one of my jobs, on the last day of the draft was, hey, Matt, you have $10,000 to give out in bonuses. We need 3 receivers to bring in undrafted. And I brought in Josh Cribbs, so that's a home run. I gave him like $9,900, and the other 2, I have no idea who they were. And Cribbs was in Kent State, and I got Paul Warfield, who's a Hall of Famer, was one of our scouts, to get on the phone with Cribbs, and we nailed him. So that was huge. So actually, a lot of my Steeler friends around here give me a hard time because Cribbs used to kill the Steelers, and that was my fault.
That's pretty funny. And I know I've heard you mention this too, because that is kind of funny that you from Pittsburgh, you grow up following the Steelers, and you end up scouting for the Browns, like the damn Browns of all things. And I think I remember hearing you say on a Football Today podcast at one point, you'd get all this free shit from the Browns, obviously.
Oh, so much.
You can't give it all. You can't give it away because none of your friends want it.
My wife's the only one that I know that would wear Browns gear, even though I was employed there. I'd send my buddies Browns Christmas cards, and they'd rip them up or piss on them or something. But meanwhile, we were the worst team in the league, and the Steelers were 15-1, and it was Big Ben's rookie year. I mean, we weren't a big threat.
Yeah, no kidding.
But Phil sat me down right after the draft and said, "I'm bringing in my guys from the Ravens," and so be it. And then there was about a month there that I was worried that I might be out of football, though.
Yeah, but you weren't. So next step is ESPN, right? I mean, how did, like you mentioned, I think you said Danny Green's son or something, he played a role in that.
He did, and Jeremy Green, he's now actually in jail, and that's a long story, and he's no longer around. But he and Todd McShay and a handful of other people started Scouts Inc. Do you remember Scouts Inc. like 10 years ago? Yeah, and he basically said, "Hey, do you want to do some work for us?" So I started writing scouting reports for them after about 2 months of working with my uncle, and who's in construction, and I absolutely hate that. I mean, I was just making some bucks. So I didn't know what to do. And Jeremy called and he said, hey, we need a guy at Scouts Inc. to, start doing stuff with us. And the owner of Scouts Inc. started to really like me. And fortunately, the timing was awesome. Was like 2 months after I started with them, ESPN bought Scouts Inc. So all those guys that started Scouts Inc. became very, very wealthy. I mean, it was a home run for them business wise to have their small company bought by such a big company, but it gave me a job, and it was by far the best pay I'd ever got. I'm like, this is great. I'll work for ESPN. They never go 2-14. So, and the way we set it up then was Jeremy was like the director of pro scouting. We had another former scout who was like the second guy, and I was kind of like the third guy in charge. And as people left and as my star kind of grew, I kind of became the top dog there for a while. And then they kind of erased all the Scouts Inc. stuff, and I just became, the ESPN employee that a lot of people remember and like you remember. And, Jeremy started Football Today, and I used to be a regular guest. Every Friday I would break down games with him. And then when he went bye-bye, I took over the whole thing by myself and kind of saved the podcast. And then, Ross came on, and then Roflo, and, and like you said, I did everything you can imagine at ESPN, chats and every kind of article you can write, and some fantasy. And, I often tell this story, and I was telling it last night too, that it was like my third or fourth year at ESPN. And I'm like, let's go to a couple of the editors. And I'm like, hey, if you want, I'll do some fantasy stuff for you guys too. I've been playing, fantasy my whole life. And they're like, Williamson, you were in the league, man. You're way above that. You're way too overqualified for fantasy. That's not, that's beneath you. Like, and meanwhile, yeah,
I remember you telling that story in one of the Dynasty Blueprint podcasts recently, and I was driving home from work and I had to laugh because I mean even still, like, obviously I hope none of my employers are listening to this, but no, I'm just kidding. I'm not gonna say anything that bad, but as much as fantasy's grown, like, it's still completely the redheaded stepchild, like at work, like it's
oh, I bet at your place, yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's a lot
over at ESPN. You know how many insider subscriptions they sold because of fantasy? I mean, it was gigantic.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and that's another thing too that I think. Again, I'm like heavy subtweeting so many people at work right now, but like, that's the thing I think people don't realize. Like, people only read your news shit because they want to know what's going on with their fantasy players, right? Like, right. There's so much of that, and that's just, it is really funny how things have progressed so quickly. And like, I mean, fantasy is the biggest moneymaker. Like, I can guarantee you for a fact, like, we bring in more traffic at fantasy than any of the other portions of NFL.com. But it's still like,
same at ESPN, absolutely.
Right? It's like, oh yeah, fantasy over there. You're just sit in your corner and start cranking out more content.
All right, you don't know what you're talking about, right?
That we're not gonna put on the homepage. But anyway.
But it was a great 10 years at ESPN, and as most people know, they had massive budget cuts lately, and a lot of us weren't brought back. So I lasted 10 years, which is a lot longer than most people. The majority of the people I worked with when I got there were no longer there. And It's been great since. I mean, I'm still churning it out.
10 years is pretty impressive. So essentially, again, kind of, just budget cuts and everything like that. That's got to still be pretty. Was there any moment where that was kind of tough, because I would have.
Sure. Because it was very good money. It was very stable. I had done it for 10 years. And it almost got to the point there, too, that I kind of became a guy without a home. Like, near the end there, I didn't even know who I reported to, because do I report the NFL? Do I report the podcast? Do I report the fantasy? So I was kind of like a nomad, and I was doing a little of each. So you could see where none of those, situations would necessarily like jump on the table that we can't lose Matt. Although podcasting did, but all my budgets were coming from ESPN.com, and podcasting is radio. It's just such a big organization that it's hard to. Podcasting basically got me for free for 10 years, and they couldn't come up with enough to just keep me by myself or whatever. I don't know all the details, but whatever. I mean, Roflo's moved on. I guess that the Football Day podcast has changed quite a bit, but. I'll be honest with you. I don't subscribe anymore. now that you're gone, I don't listen anymore. So I'm not bashing anyone, but I get a tweet a day saying it's not the same. I'm unsubscribing. I miss you. So whatever. I mean, that's cool. But it was a great 10 years. I don't have any hard feelings. If they called me next year and say, "Hey, we'd love to have you back," I would be all ears. Yeah, for sure. So now you're essentially just like a gun for hire. I mean, obviously, doing the Dynasty Blueprint. How much different is that than being? Because I mean, obviously, that's what I was doing. That's what I was doing before I came. Got the NFL job,
and it is a completely, I would say personally, it's a completely different like working experience. But is it how much of a change has it been?
A lot. And I'm writing for Today's Pigskin. I'm writing for The Score, and they're both really growing, and they're putting a lot of money into their NFL department, and they're honestly very thrilled to have me. I mean, I'm a name, and I'm bringing them a lot of recognition.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm also talking to other people still, and it wouldn't shock me if I hooked on to somewhere a little bit more well-known in the next year or so. But everything's by the article. So, I mean, the money's starting to be very, very similar now, and I'm pumping out articles like crazy, though. I mean, if you look at my Twitter timeline anymore, it's like, here's 1,000 words on this, here's 1,000 words on that. And it doesn't mean I'm hustling more. It's just they're loving it, and I'm doing more and more and more, where ESPN might be like, hey, give us your normal typical Tuesday one. You get to be more of a routine, where now it's like I'm a little bit more on call.
Yeah, that's for sure. That is a big difference to doing it by the article thing. So, I mean, yeah, it's a hell of a story, though. I mean,
it is. I know it's a long one, and I hope I kept people's interest, but it's a very unconventional method of getting where I did. And in terms of people getting in the league or even GAing or working for big colleges, there's nobody I knew in all my years, with the exception of one guy, and you may have heard of him, Ben McAdoo, who's now the head coach of the Giants. He and I, we were graduate assistants at Pitt. He's the only one I knew that never played football, competitively and got anywhere in this league.
Right. That is pretty interesting. So, I mean, yeah, but you kind of held a different position in every sort of spot. Like you went around a lot. I mean, I don't want to say I guess, what was your favorite thing what's your favorite job title you had? Was it the one at ESPN, or what's kind of stuck with you the most?
At ESPN, because I mean, deep down, I worked from home for 10 years. I mean, I wear workout shorts every day, so I see my kids a ton. I loved working for a team. I miss game day. I miss going down to the weight room and lifting with the guys, and then making fun of you how little you can lift, and and getting to know people and players and equipment guys and having that team atmosphere. But the trade-off is I see my kids all the time. I mean, I see too much of them, if anything. So that's a good trade-off for me. I mean, I'm not anxious. It would take a lot for me to go back to the league and never be home.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Yeah, I know people. There was an article surfacing around recently that that the Eagles or somebody had tried to pluck Daniel Jeremiah or something, and I was like, man, I know DJ's gig inside and out, his whole setup.
He took my job at the Browns when I got let go at the Browns. He came in the next week as a scout. He's a good guy.
Yeah, he's very nice. I think we've bumped into him a few times here and there, but yeah, I know he's got a real good setup with us here. Yeah. I would imagine it would take a lot to pry somebody like that back to the NFL. So
I mean, Todd used to ask me all the time, what was it like being with the Browns? That's like the one thing he hasn't done. He's been scouting forever, but he's never scouted for a team. I'm like, dude, your gig's way better than that. I mean, yeah, it pays way better. I mean, I wouldn't consider moving if I were you. But no, yeah. I mean, what I'm doing, and I feel like, to go back to a quick brag, I mean, I feel like at this stage in my life, having done this for 15 years or in the media now for my 11th year, I feel like I'll probably, not that I'm safe or I can rest on my laurels, but I can do this the rest of my life and make money. I think I've kind of made it,
No, I understand that. And there's definitely, once you get, because, I mean, like anything, the NFL even more so than media, but there's definitely people, there's a network.
Right.
I've said, I've only been on the scene, I've only been in NFL for, I guess, 8 months or so, but I've been people knew who I was before that. And I know that if for some reason, I quit this job at NFL, I've already had people, and again, I'm not trying to brag on myself, but that's what this podcast is about. It's about bragging about yourself. But I know that if NFL, right. Yeah, exactly. Really, I just always bring people on just somehow compliment me for at least 5 seconds.
Right. But sneak in all the good stuff you do.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Sure. But I know that, yeah, if I decided I was I don't want to work for NFL anymore, and I tweeted it out, I already know, I've had people tell me that, I'd get picked up somewhere else and 3.5 seconds. So I mean, yeah, there's definitely a status.
It's said and done. I mean, I was told that for 10 years too, and then
yeah,
there has to be an opening. But along those
true.
lines, after pounding on doors and I've talked to all the big sites as you can imagine, but none of them are like, "Who are you again?" They were like, "Yeah, if we have a spot, we'll hire you." I mean, you know, I mean, like it was never like, "Hey, can you write a resume and tell me some stuff you did?" And they know who you are.
Yeah, exactly. So, I guess just kind of like closing out here, what's the one piece of advice you would give to somebody, like somebody asks you, you know, and like I said, we get this question all the time, and I think your story speaks for itself, but like one grand overarching theme, like if there's one thing you could convey to somebody that wants to get a job either with the NFL or even in media, like what's the serious one thing you would like hammer home to them?
Now, the three things that stand out from my path were, I was very lucky. You know, I mean, I certainly had some bounces that went my way. I mean, if Ralph Sinrich wasn't a customer and didn't buy Lemieux's house, I probably would have never known anybody. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people, but I also made my own luck too. I mean, I was also extremely ambitious and I worked extremely, extremely hard. And I also had extremely good backing, you know, especially my wife, my parents, everybody else, you know, they were like, "Hey, you're going to take a shot at your dream and, you know, go for it." And so all those three things were huge. But I think you absolutely have to look at it and say, I might not make any money for a while. You know, I mean, I made $1,000 a month for a long time.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, even trying to live off like freelance writing is difficult and everything like that. And like you said, until you reach like a certain status and people know you and they want to pay you well, like if you're just nobody off the street, it's hard to command money. It's hard to command attention. That's for sure. But no, I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Start your own stuff too. You know, like, hey, I'll just start my own podcast. You know, like, fortunately, people followed me. But if I was Joe Blow off the street, no one's gonna listen to your podcast. Right out there, right? Exactly.
I mean, and your website too. Like, you gotta do something to stand out. Like, if you're not a name, like nobody's gonna go to you. You know, nobody like. I think we talked about this in previous episodes too. Like, nobody cares about, you know, John Smith's fantasy football rankings. Like, there's 1,000 ones out there.
Right.
Yeah, like that sort of stuff. You have to make unique content. I think that literally comes up every episode. And
I would assume that's a huge part with you. I mean, the reception put you on the map.
Oh yeah, that was it. I mean, before that I was just trying my hand at, like, you know, just trying to write like everything, you know, opinion pieces. I was doing power rankings, which it's like, really, nobody cares. Nobody gives a shit about Matt Harmon's power rankings. right. I mean, back in like 2013, like, okay, so you have the Browns at 29. Don't care what you think. Like, you're nobody.
So,
right. And that is an important thing for people to remember. And I can't stress that enough. It's when reception perception happened, that's when Football Guys happened. That's when Optimum Scouting I was working with for a while. So, and then, you know, things snowballed from there,
right.
You know, especially last off season. Then people like Evan Silva hear about you and tweet, you know, that sort of stuff. I mean, that is how you get on the radar if you're a nobody like I was starting out. But
like, you can work, like I said, you have to be ambitious. You have to work super hard, but don't work dumb either. I mean, don't just start putting power rankings out and think somebody cares.
Right. Like, you could spend plenty of time constructing really long, in-depth power rankings and, you know, spend 4 hours on that or whatever and writing it really well, being well spoken, but yeah, nobody cares. But if you come up, like, spend those extra 4 hours, like, you know, watching game film or like going over like athletic testing formula or something, to trying to find something that nobody else is talking about is way more worth your time.
Oh yeah. And if you're in college, go knock on the director of football operations door at whatever university you're at and say, "Hey, can I clean jock straps? You know, can I do anything?" You know, I mean, because when you're in school, you have an opportunity there that they might get hired. You could be around the team, you know, and once you're in, then you get the next gig. You know, I mean, you said you need to get in the building of a team, and that goes a long way.
Yeah, I imagine that definitely makes a big difference. But so yeah, Matt, any other closing parting shots? I mean, told a great story.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun, and I don't know that, you know, in all my time that I've been on the air in the last 10 years, I mean, I've told bits and pieces of my story, but I don't think I've ever done start to finish, you know, and start till now. So thanks, I appreciate the opportunity. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people will really learn a lot from your perspective. I know we had Josh Norris on. He spent some time with the NFL, with an NFL team, but like, you definitely were like he was like an intern or something, but you were like a legit
Mm-hmm.
NFL scout. So you're a big get for the podcast. So I appreciate
Thanks, man.
I appreciate you coming on and everything. And yeah, like I said, I've been following Matt's work for a long time. Still do. Like, yeah, make sure you guys follow him too on Twitter at Williamson NFL. But that's it for today's episode. Again, I always really appreciate everybody listening, and I hate, going over the promotional stuff, but I mean, if you do like the show, make sure you subscribe on iTunes, leave a rating or review on Stitcher, all that sort of stuff. I'm not going to say, but we might have a pretty really exciting guest coming next week. So I'm very excited about that. Yeah. So I'm pumped about that. Hopefully that works out. So, definitely stay tuned, subscribe to the podcast. We got a lot more coming up. And again, I want to thank everybody for listening, and I hope you learned something today.